I want to be straight with you. There's a $2 powder sitting under most American kitchen sinks right now that will turn a struggling rosebush into a bloom factory in a single season. It used to be in every laundry room in the country. Then, starting in 1993, state after state quietly pulled it off the shelves, and 19 states have restrictions on it today. And the reason has nothing to do with your roses and everything to do with what it does in lakes and rivers. My Amish neighbor Daniel never stopped using it. He's been feeding his rose hedge with it for 40 years. Stick with me to the end because I'll show you the exact pinch and water ratio Daniel uses, plus the one fall timing trick that doubles next year's blooms. Let me back up and tell you exactly how this powder vanished from American kitchens, because the story matters. The suppressing force here wasn't a single villain. It was the laundry detergent industry's reformulation cascade, and it started in 1993 when Maryland passed the first wave of phosphate detergent restrictions in response to what was happening in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. Pennsylvania followed. Then the Great Lakes states fell in line one after another. Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, New York, Pennsylvania, again on dishwasher detergents. Plus Virginia, North Carolina, Florida, Vermont, Washington, Oregon, Montana, Maine, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts. Today there are 19 states with restrictions on phosphate detergent products. The named anchor behind all of it was Lake Erie. The late 1980s algae blooms in that lake were a genuine ecological emergency, and the policy response was a real one. Here's the part most folks miss. Trisodium phosphate itself, the powder under the sink, was never banned outright in most of those states. What got restricted was phosphate-containing laundry and dishwasher detergent. But once Tide and Cheer and the rest reformulated to phosphate-free, there was no longer a reason for a grocery store or a hardware store to keep a box of TSP on the shelf next to the laundry soap. It moved to the paint aisle, where painters use it for scrubbing walls before priming. And the average American household just stopped seeing it. I'll be honest with you, I was right there. I switched to Miracle Grow Bloom Booster in the early 1990s, a $30 bag of the same phosphorus chemistry dressed up for the garden aisle, and I never once asked why my neighbor Daniel's roses kept outperforming mine for the next decade. I just bought another bag every spring. Here's the math. A $2 box of TSP will feed a 12 rose hedge for 5 full seasons. The commercial Bloom Booster runs $25 to $30 a bag, and most folks burn through one a year. Your grandmother had a box of this powder under her sink in 1985. Most of you have no idea it still exists. All right, let's keep going. Here's what's actually in that $2 box. The powder is trisodium phosphate, TSP for short. You'll find it sold under brand names like Savagran or Red Devil in a plain white and red box about the size of a paperback book, sitting on the bottom shelf of the paint prep aisle at any hardware store in America. Home Depot has it, Lowe's has it, your local Ace has it, $2 to $4, depending on where you live, 1 pound of powder. And here's the part that should make you sit up. That single 1 pound box is enough to feed 12 mature rose bushes for 5 full growing seasons. 5. I want you to think about that next to the bag of Bloom Booster you bought last May for $28 and finished by August. Daniel keeps 1 box of TSP on his shelf in his garden shed next to the Broad Fork and the Whetstone. He buys a new one every 5 or 6 years. That's it. That's the whole input cost on a rose hedge that, in a good July, will put out more blooms than I can count from 100 feet away. You'll never see this powder mentioned in a Better Homes and Gardens Rose Care article. You'll never see it mentioned in the gardening section of the newspaper. And the reason isn't a conspiracy. It's just that those articles are paid for directly or indirectly by the same companies selling the $30 bag. Nobody is paid to remind you that the cleaning aisle has the same chemistry for $2. So the information just quietly stops moving. That's the first layer. Now let's talk about why it works. Here's the thing most American gardeners were never taught. Plants need 3 macronutrients in the largest quantities: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, NPK. Those 3 numbers on every fertilizer bag. Nitrogen builds leaves and stems. Potassium builds roots and overall plant toughness. And phosphorus, that middle number for phosphorus, builds blooms. Phosphorus is what triggers a rose to set a flower bud instead of just pushing out another leaf. Phosphorus is what drives the energy molecule called ATP that the plant uses to actually construct a flower. No phosphorus, no flowers. Or And this is closer to the truth in most American backyards. Not enough phosphorus, not enough flowers. Now look at TSP. The NPK analysis on trisodium phosphate works out to essentially zero nitrogen, around 75% phosphate, zero potassium, effectively a 0.750. There is almost nothing on the consumer market that touches that concentration. A typical bloom booster bag is something like 10-30-20, meaning 30% of the bag is the phosphate fraction. TSP is more than double that in a powder you measure by the quarter teaspoon. Here's where it gets interesting and where most people miss the whole picture. Suburban American soil is, in the great majority of cases, nitrogen saturated and phosphorus starved. I want to say that again because it's the single most important sentence in this video. The soil under most American rose bushes has too much nitrogen and not enough phosphorus. Why? Because for 60 years, American homeowners have been pouring lawn fertilizer onto every square foot of property they own. Lawn fertilizer is heavy on the nitrogen. That's what makes the grass green. Year after year of that nitrogen runs through the soil, builds up in some places, leaches the phosphorus out in others, and leaves you with a soil profile that grows beautiful green rose bushes with hardly any blooms on them. I had my own soil tested in 2008. I was 8 years into Daniel's methods, but I'd never had the soil professionally analyzed. The result came back: high nitrogen, very low phosphorus. And this was already after years of compost. The lawn fertilizer my father had put down in the 1990s, before I knew any better, was still echoing through that soil 30 years later. That's how stubborn this imbalance is. So you've got a plant that needs phosphorus to bloom, growing in soil that's been drained of phosphorus, while the homeowner stands there wondering why a rose bush that put out 40 buds last June is putting out 12 this June. The answer is in the soil chemistry, not in the rose. Daniel said it to me one afternoon, leaning on his hoe, watching me look at his hedge. He said, "Roses want phosphorus, Bill. The package on the shelf changed. The roses didn't." That sentence stuck with me for 10 years before I really understood what he meant. The roses haven't changed. The biology of how a rose makes a flower hasn't changed since before any of us were born. What changed is which boxes the store decided to stock and which ones got pulled. Daniel kept buying the box. Most of America stopped. And the rose bushes, millions of them in millions of yards, quietly slid into a state of low-grade phosphorus deficiency that nobody diagnosed because nobody was looking for it. They just figured roses are hard, or they switched varieties, or they pulled the whole bush out and planted hydrangeas. There's a reason the Amish have been doing this the same way for 200 years, and Daniel hasn't budged from it for 40. He's not running soil tests. He's not reading the back of a fertilizer bag. He's doing what his father did, and his father did what worked. And the powder that worked in 1965 still works today because the chemistry didn't move when the marketing did. One more piece on the mechanism, because I want you to understand why this is so much faster acting than what you've been buying. Most commercial bloom boosters use organic bound or slow release phosphorus sources. They have to break down through the soil microbes before the plant can take them up. That can take weeks. TSP is already a soluble phosphate the moment you dissolve it in water. The rose roots can pull it in essentially as fast as they encounter it. You apply it on a Saturday afternoon, by the next weekend you can already see the change in cane vigor in the stage of bud development. I've watched it happen on my own bushes. I've watched it happen on Daniel's. It is not subtle. So that's layer 2. Roses want phosphorus, the soil is drained of phosphorus, and TSP is the most concentrated, fastest acting, cheapest source of phosphorus on the consumer market. Sitting in the paint aisle, $2 a box, exactly where the laundry industry's reformulation cascade quietly parked it 30 years ago. Which brings me to layer 3, the part you actually need to write down. Daniel's ratio is not complicated, but it is exact, and the exactness matters. A quarter teaspoon of TSP dissolved fully in 1 gallon of water. That's it. Warm water dissolves it faster than cold, so I keep an old plastic milk jug on the back porch and fill it from the tap on the warm side. Drop the quarter teaspoon in, give it a shake, and let it sit while I finish my coffee. By the time I'm done, it's clear as window glass. Application is a soil drench, not a foliar spray. You are not misting the leaves. You are pouring it slowly at the drip line, that ring of soil directly under the outer edge of the bush's canopy, which is where the active feeder roots live. 1 gallon per mature plant, half a gallon for a first-year rose that hasn't put down a full root system yet. Frequency is once every 3 weeks during the active growing season. For me, in Zone 6B, that's the first week of April through the last week of August. I mark it on the kitchen calendar. 5 doses a season, give or take. That is the entire maintenance program. Now, here's the rule Daniel was emphatic about, and I want you to hear me on this one. Always water the rose with plain water first. Soak the soil at the drip line with a regular watering can or hose for a minute or two before you apply the TSP solution. Never pour it onto dry soil. Phosphate at any meaningful concentration on dry roots will burn the fine hair roots, and those are exactly the roots that absorb nutrients. You'd be undoing the whole point. Plain water first, then the TSP solution, then walk away. I'll tell you exactly what convinced me this protocol works. I have a single shrub rose on the south side of the house near the stamen apple. Old plant, I've had it about 15 years. In spring of 2020, before I started Daniel's protocol, I counted the blooms on it. I counted 47. I started Daniel's TSP regimen in mid-May of that same year, late by his standards, but I wanted to test it on a plant I knew. By the second flush in late July of 2020, that same bush had pushed 78 blooms on the same plant, same soil, same year. The only variable was a quarter teaspoon of a $2 powder, dissolved in a gallon of water, applied every 3 weeks, and that's the kind of result that made me feel a little foolish for the 25 years I'd spent buying $25 bags of Bloom Booster from the garden center. The phosphorus was always the active ingredient. I was just paying 10 times more for it because the marketing was fancier. Now, layer 4 is where this gets really interesting, and it's the part most rose growers, even ones who've heard of TSP, never figure out. Phosphorus, when you put it into soil in this form, does not just sit there as a free-floating chemical waiting to wash away. Within 48 hours of application, it binds tightly to clay particles and organic matter in the soil. It locks on. That binding is exactly why the lakes and rivers concern doesn't apply to garden use the way it applied to laundry wastewater. In the watershed, phosphate was flushing straight through municipal pipes into open water at industrial volume. In your soil, a quarter teaspoon per gallon at the drip line binds to the soil structure within 2 days and stays put. That binding is also the reason small frequent doses outperform one big dose at the start of the season. The bound phosphorus releases slowly back to the roots over the following weeks as those roots grow toward it and as soil microbes work the bound molecules loose. So when you apply again 3 weeks later, you're not refilling an empty tank and you're topping up a reservoir that's been feeding the plant the whole time. One big dose in April would mostly bind, mostly release before the heaviest bloom demand in July, and leave the plant short during exactly the wrong window. Daniel figured this out the way Daniel figures everything out. Not from a lab study, but from 50 years of watching what his roses did when he changed what he gave them. Daniel's hedge runs along the south edge of his vegetable garden. A row of old-fashioned shrub roses, a heritage pink rugosa type he took cuttings of from his mother's garden back in the 1980s. 40 years of TSP at a quarter teaspoon per gallon every 3 weeks, April through August. I walked past that hedge in mid-July of 2019. I stopped at 1 cane on a single bush, 1 cane, not the whole bush, and I counted close to 60 blooms on it, 60 on 1 cane. I had to walk around to the other side and look at it from the back to convince myself I was counting right. When I asked Daniel about it that afternoon, he said the line I've quoted in my own head 100 times since: roses want phosphorus, Bill. The package on the shelf changed. The roses didn't. That's the whole thing in one sentence. The chemistry didn't move. The marketing did. And here's the depth piece most people miss. Phosphorus-sufficient roses don't just bloom more, they get sick less. Plants that have all the phosphorus they want produce thicker cuticle layers on their leaves. The cuticle is the waxy outer skin. Thicker cuticle means black spot fungus has a harder time penetrating the leaf, and powdery mildew has a harder time establishing on the surface. Daniel's hedge has been hit by black spot maybe twice in the years I've been watching it. My old roses back when I was on the conventional program got it every July like clockwork. I used to spray fungicide. I haven't sprayed fungicide in 15 years. The phosphorus did the work the spray was trying to do, and it did it from the inside out. That's the kind of thing the standard rose care advice will never put together for you, because the standard rose care advice is selling you the spray and the bloom booster. So that's the 4 layers. The powder is TSP. The mechanism is phosphorus driving bud formation in soil that's been drained of it. The protocol is a quarter teaspoon per gallon soil drench at the drip line every 3 weeks, April through August, after pre-watering. And the depth piece is that the binding behavior makes garden scale use both safer and more effective than any commercial bloom booster on the market. Now, if you've stayed with me this far, and you're starting to see how the Amish handle a rose bush differently than the way most of us were taught, I want to point you towards something. Everything I've walked through today works because of the soil it lands in. Phosphorus availability, mycorrhizal networks, soil pH. They all decide whether the TSP you apply actually reaches the rose roots or whether it locks up in the wrong form. I lay all of that out in Chapter 4 of my book, The 30-Day Amish Pest-Proof Garden Protocol. The chapter is called Building Pest-Proof Soil, and it's the framework Daniel taught me, the same one that makes this rose method and most everything else actually work work in your dirt. The book is $17 at backyardbuildbooks.com. If you're watching on the TV right now, point your phone camera at the QR code on the screen. If you're on a phone or laptop, the link is right in the description below the video. Take a second now to go ahead and grab your phone. I'll wait, no rush. It's for folks who are tired of the chemical treadmill and want a complete system, not a scattered tip here and there. Backyardbuildbooks.com. All right, let's keep going because I want to come back to the suppression question. What done you like? Why this powder vanished from American household memory and what really happened in the 1990s? Because the story is more interesting than the conspiracy version. The phosphate detergent restrictions that started rolling out in 1993 were a real and justified environmental response to a real environmental problem. I want to be straight with you about that. Lake Erie in the late 1980s was in genuine trouble. Algae blooms were choking the surface. The algae were consuming the dissolved oxygen as they died and decayed, and fish kills were happening on a scale that made the front page of the papers. The Chesapeake Bay watershed was on a similar trajectory. The phosphate that was driving those blooms was coming in significant part from laundry detergent. Millions of households flushing high phosphate wastewater down the drain through municipal systems into rivers that emptied into those watersheds. That's the eutrophication mechanism in plain English. Too much phosphorus feeds too much algae. The algae eats the oxygen and the fish suffocate. Maryland was first to act in 1993. The rest of the Great Lakes states followed. Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, New York, Pennsylvania, then Virginia, North Carolina, Florida, Vermont, Washington, Oregon, Montana, Maine, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, 19 states with restrictions on phosphate content in laundry and dishwasher detergents today. Here's the part nobody planned. TSP itself, the standalone powder, was not banned in most of those states. The restrictions were on phosphate-containing detergents, the laundry and dish products. Practical effect was that detergent companies reformulated. They pivoted to phosphate-free formulas. And once the laundry brand stopped containing phosphate, the standalone TSP box that used to sit on the laundry shelf, the heavy-duty additive grandma kept under the sink for stains and pre-treatment, lost its retail home. It got moved to the paint aisle, where it survives today as a wall cleaner. And once it was off the laundry shelf, an entire generation of Americans simply stopped knowing it existed. Meanwhile, the lawn and garden fertilizer industry, which is roughly a $9 billion annual business in the United States, saw an opening and walked through it. Bloom booster bags at $25 to $30 a piece, containing essentially the same phosphate chemistry at 1/10 the concentration, became the standard recommendation. No regulation pushed this, no conspiracy, just an economic vacuum that filled itself the way economic vacuums do. The counter-argument deserves to be acknowledged. Yes, doctor, you should never dump TSP near a storm drain or a creek. You should never broadcast it across a lawn. The garden application doses I'm describing, a quarter teaspoon dissolved in a gallon of water bound to soil within 48 hours, applied at the drip line of an individual bush, are roughly 1/10,000th the scale of what was flowing out of municipal laundry systems in the 1980s. It is not the same problem. It is not even the same category of problem. And the cost to you personally of having lost track of this powder, roughly $25 to $30 a year in unnecessary fertilizer spend per rose grower, plus the bigger loss, the average suburban rose, in my experience in Daniels, is producing 40 to 50% fewer blooms than its genetics will allow, because the one nutrient that drives bloom formation is the one nutrient most often missing from the soil it's planted in. The powder didn't get banned for being dangerous. It got removed from household memory because no large industry had any reason to keep reminding you it was there. I stopped buying it myself around 1995, not because anyone told me not to, but because it stopped being on the shelf next to the things I was already buying. That's how this kind of forgetting happens, quietly, over a decade, one reformulation at a time. Now here's the part I promised you at the beginning, the fall timing trick, the one that doubles next year's blooms, and I want to be straight with you. This is the single most underused practice in American rose growing, and once you understand why, you'll never skip it again. Here's what Daniel taught me. Roses don't decide in May how many blooms they're going to throw. They decide in September. The flower bud primordia, the tiny structures that become next year's roses, form at the base of the canes during late summer and early fall before the plant goes dormant. Whatever phosphorus is in the soil during that 4-week window is what gets translocated directly into those forming buds. Miss the window, you get an average rose next spring. Hit it, you get a bloom factory. Daniel's exact words. Next year's roses are made in September, Bill, not in May. Here's the dose. You're going to double the maintenance ratio, half a teaspoon of TSP per gallon of water, 1 gallon per mature plant, applied exactly once. Soil drench at the drip line after pre-watering with plain water. No, same rule as before, never on dry soil. The timing is 4 weeks before your first hard frost. For me, in Lancaster County, first hard frost lands somewhere between October 18th and 22nd, so I dose the hedge between September 20th and 25th. Figure out your local first hard frost date and count back 4 weeks. That's your window. Now here's where the standard rose care advice gets it exactly backwards. Every article you'll read online tells you to stop feeding roses in fall. And for nitrogen, that advice is correct. Nitrogen pushes tender new growth that gets winter killed, but phosphorus doesn't push soft growth. Phosphorus drives bud set. Lumping them together and saying don't feed in fall is how American rose growers throw away half their next year's blooms without realizing it. Let me give you the number from my own garden. The stamen area shrub rose I mentioned on spring 2020, no fall TSP, I counted 47 blooms across the whole plant. That September, I gave it 1 fall dose at the doubled ratio. Spring 2021, 94 blooms doubled from a single application of a $2 powder applied on one specific weekend in September. That's the trick, and it's the kind of thing you'll never see in a glossy rose care column because the whole industry is set up to sell you spring fertilizer. Before I let you go, I want to come back to one more piece of this. Everything I just walked you through, the fall window, the maintenance ratio, the 4 weeks before frost timing, that's one item on a year-round Amish calendar Daniel runs his whole garden by. Fruit trees in February, vegetables in March, roses in September, cellar prep in October. Chapter 9 of my book, Seasonal Maintenance Calendar, lays the whole calendar out week by week. It's the chapter that turns scattered tips into a complete system, and that's what most folks tell me they were missing. The book is called The 30-Day Amish Pest-Proof Garden Protocol. You can find it at backyardbillbooks.com. That's backyardbillbooks.com. If you're watching on your TV, grab your phone and point it at the QR code on screen. Take your time finding your phone. I'll wait right here. If you're already on your phone or laptop, the link is sitting in the description below. So there it is. A $2 box of trisodium phosphate used at Daniel's pinch and water ratio every 3 weeks from April through August, plus the half teaspoon dose 4 weeks before first hard frost. That combination will outperform any commercial bloom booster on the shelf for a fraction of the price. The powder is still there, still $2, still works exactly the way it did in 1985. They just stopped reminding you it existed. Daniel will dose his rose hedge again this September the same way he did 40 years ago and the same way his mother fed her roses before him. The next one of these I'm working on is wood ash for fruit trees, another humble pantry trick that the orchard industry would rather you forgot. Try the TSP method on a single rose this season. Drop a note in the comments next spring and tell me your bloom count. I'll see you in the next one.